Martin Outram, welcome to Beyond Stage Fright. You've been the viola player in the Maggini Quartet since its formation in 1988, and before that the Bachmann Quartet with two of the other members of the quartet from 1983. The Maggini Quartet is considered to be one of the finest British string quartets, renowned for its interpretations of British repertoire and for commissioning new music. It's made more than 40 recordings and has won many awards, including a Gramophone Award and 2 Grammy nominations. Aside from the quartet, you yourself perform as a soloist, you perform with your viola-piano duo, and you're also Professor of Viola and Chamber Music at the Royal Academy of Music. So what's it like being part of an established quartet for over 30 years?
Well, it's more than half my life. It's an extraordinary thing to think of. Actually, I've never thought of it like that, but an amazing privilege. I always considered it a great privilege to be a musician, let alone a string quartet player. And of course, it's been a way of life, really. So I've never thought of it as a job. It's a way of life. Being involved in some of the greatest music ever written, and it's been a huge privilege and joy, I use that word most of the time, to have journeyed through this incredible repertoire with my colleagues, friends and colleagues.
And how do you manage the dynamics with that group scenario where you know people so well and you've played with them for so long?
I think that's taken a long time to evolve. I guess with any kind of deep relationship in a way, there are some rough times, especially in the early stages. We were all quite young and pretty hot-headed, and I always joke that I sort of found out how loudly I could shout. It's not to my credit at all in the first few years of the quartet, but it was a huge learning curve for all of us, and working out where each other's strengths and weaknesses were. And it's certainly true, you learn to trust each other, and then as the years go by you kind of mellow and you just take things as they are. You keep trying to push each other further, but equally some battles are probably best put to one side and just sort of all move on together.
And how do you manage performance nerves as part of the quartet?
That's such an interesting question. I mean, that it's difficult to know where to start with that one. I think sometimes we all know what can, as I said earlier, what our strengths and weaknesses are, and I think over the years we've grown to be very sympathetic to each other. I think we've always been sympathetic, but that's never changed, and I think we are quite sort of sensitive to each other's possible triggers in certain situations, and I think we've all learned pretty much to I think I've been very lucky that I think we'd all count ourselves pretty lucky that we've been very supportive towards each other. So we've never been a quartet that's kind of put anyone out on a limb. We've always, what's good for one is good for all, as it were, in situations. So we've always felt very much in it all together.
Do you ever talk to each other about it, or is it just something that's sort of understood?
Yeah, we do actually. We have talked about it, and we know over the years we've come to know what can be a trigger for certain colleagues in certain situations, and so I think we'd all agree that probably tiredness is something that can trigger nerves, but equally. Each member has their own idiosyncrasies, which are not shared by others because they have their own, bag of goodies, as it were. It's not something we talk about very often, but it's something we're all aware of and are all supportive of each other.
And what about your own personal journey with this? Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yes, I talk to my students quite often about being nervous, because it was something which was never really discussed when I was a student, and I've tried to make it clear that just about everyone I've ever played with, over a period of time, you get to know. You might think they're bulletproof to start with, but actually over a period of time you get to realise that even they have certain, I don't want to put it weaknesses, but fragilities, shall we say. And I think all the most interesting musicians, they actually you come to realise, not that you're looking for it, but sooner or later, if you work with someone for long enough, there'll be a situation wherein a slight, vulnerability will appear. Of course, I guess there are some people who just play safe and it doesn't trouble them too much. But if you're really sort of going for it full on, yeah, and you're pushing the boundaries out and you're not playing safely, then almost inevitably that can come with some successes, hopefully mostly successes, but also some slight failures.
Did you have times, for example, when you were much younger where you did have nerves and then you've managed to sort of work through them or deal better with them because of experience?
Yeah, I think so. That's true. That's definitely true. Although I'm not saying that I don't get nervous now. That would be not true. I do, and there can be still certain triggers for me. But yes, I think a lot of the things that when I was younger that fazed me probably wouldn't faze me as much as they do. They wouldn't faze me as much now as they did then. I think one does go through life developing strategies to cope with situations, and also I think the notion that some days you're going to have one hopes for it. If you have a scale of 0 to 10, you hope for a sort of 9, and on a few occasions in your life maybe a 9.5, and absolutely extraordinarily 10 if it goes better than you could possibly have imagined. But mostly one's in the kind of 7 to 9 category, hopefully. And then some days you're going to have a day where you come off the stage and think, oh, that didn't feel good at all. That might be a 3. But hopefully even then there are some redeeming qualities. But it's certainly not going to be a 9 or a 10 every single time you walk on a platform.
So how do you keep your focus on stage as a group, as a quartet?
Well, that is always the case. I think that's one of the most exciting things about the quartet, or indeed playing with in a duo, is that it's not just yourself. You're always responding to your colleagues, and that can be both extremely exhilarating, that's the hope, and that one's carried along in the moment. However, if you are feeling fragile, that can also be the source of nerves. Because if someone's doing, if you're finding something that's very hard, very slow, for example, and someone plays even more slowly than you would want, then that can sort of make one think, help, is my bow going to be long enough here? Or something like that. Or I suppose the flip side of that, some colleagues have if it goes too fast, that can also trigger nerves, and that can be, and then they don't do as well as they might had it been just 5% slower. A relatively small thing can tip them over the edge if that's a vulnerability for them.
And in terms of audiences, how do you play together as a quartet when you're actually playing for yourselves in many ways, and yet you're also wanting to perform for an audience? I always find that's an interesting kind of dynamic to consider.
I think it's certainly true that there's an indefinable sort of vibe in the room. You can walk out on stage and it feels either really kind of energizing, kind of scary but energizing, or sometimes I suppose you can walk out on stage and feel actually that it's less so, and it is a bit sort of slightly more mundane, in which case then you're more, in a way, reliant on the energy within the group. But I certainly think that actually the group en masse, and certainly individually, you can pick up on the vibe in a room. And that, I find, also changes somehow one's perception of the room can change within the course of a concert, during a concert. So what might feel a bit scary for the first piece, by the time you got to the second piece, and certainly the second half, can feel really exciting, and you want to sort of be part of the room and its acoustic and the sheer sort of atmosphere within the room. And somehow, I guess in that sense, there's a sort of exchange with the vibe of the audience.
So how do you prepare as a group, both beforehand in terms of your rehearsal and your preparation, but also on the day, getting ready for the concert?
I think each of us would want slightly different things in some ways. What we tend to, I quite like having a relatively low-key rehearsal. If we're on tour, for example, I like having, and I think my colleagues would share this with me as well, we quite like just sitting down quite calmly and playing real nuts and bolts. We'll play a passage, slowly for intonation, or we might practice if there's a note. We always, what we say we round up the usual suspects, basically. So it could be, if there are obvious passages where ensemble's an issue, we'll dissect that, or if there's another obvious place for intonation, we'll again take that apart. But I think there's also a place for playing, real playing, going for it. So just to feel, again, the feeling of the room, the stage, if it's a large stage, or if it's a particularly resonant acoustic, or indeed the opposite actually, if it's a really dry acoustic, just really going to the extremes. So it's a real mix actually. A lot depends how much time we've got at our disposal. And also I think we're quite good at, over the years we've become better at judging what is the optimal length for a rehearsal. So I think possibly in the early days we maybe rehearsed too much on the day of the concert, and with the consequence that we were fairly tired by the actual concert. So I quite like myself actually having time to just have a nap before a concert, between rehearsal and concert. So I enjoy lying down on the floor as a sort of pre-concert, part of the pre-concert sort of ritual, if you like. Yeah.
What would you say your biggest stresses, the biggest stresses in your performing life as a quartet would be?
Playing new difficult repertoire for the first time. I mean, for us, for 5 years, we were very privileged to have the 10 quartets that Peter Maxwell Davies wrote for us, which was a fantastic journey. But it did feel like that every 6 months when a new quartet came in, we had a nervous breakdown because they weren't easy. And some of the longer ones were no less difficult. So it just meant it was a much longer quartet that was just as difficult, in some cases even more difficult than some of the shorter ones. And so first performances were always very, very stressful. And especially if they were broadcast. That definitely, and there's never enough time for that sort of thing. So we always used to joke that our first 5 performances should be banned. Because inevitably there comes a time when you can rehearse and feel relatively prepared, then you need to perform to find out where any kind of weaknesses might be, and then address those. But you can only address that if you've performed. So first performances of contemporary music, difficult contemporary music, and not just difficult contemporary music. Sometimes there's a lot of the so-called core repertoire which is not easy.
You've done more than 40 recordings. How do you find the recording studio for nerves and stress?
Well, I really enjoy recording. I enjoy the whole process. I like the fact that I enjoy the process of pacing oneself, and also the sort of, in a way, the mental discipline. Of course, because you are hoping to give as vivid a performance as possible, but equally it isn't going to be as forgiving as a live concert hall situation is going to be. But of course you've got the opportunity to retake. But I quite enjoy the sort of necessity of the mental hold you have to have on yourself to do that. And also I feel that with recording, very often one's pushing the limits. I enjoy the technical limits of sort of trying to play incredibly softly, for example. Sometimes just getting a real sort of dynamic range and range of energy and so on. That somehow seems to be, it's easier to project that in a concert hall, but much harder, I think, when the microphone's only a few feet away. So I really enjoy that challenge.
What about the rest of the quartet? Do they enjoy the recording studio?
I think they do. Yeah, I think on the whole we do. It's a great. It's always a sort of summary of our work, because we never record repertoire that we haven't performed. So although the recording is, of course, only, in a sense, a snapshot of where you're at on that particular day, nevertheless it is a summary of where you've got to by that particular point. So I think everyone's has enjoyed it, actually, over the years. I don't think anyone's dreaded it by any means, and it's also an opportunity to really kind of immerse oneself in those 2 or maybe 3 works for 3 days, and not have too many other distractions, and hopefully not have to travel too far and all those sorts of things. It is, it's quite special, really.
When you're performing, have you ever had any real performing disasters as a group on stage?
Not that I'm going to talk about now. No, of course we have. No, we have. I mean, we've all got individual stories to tell. Things like there was one time when my bow fell apart. Obviously the inevitable strings breaking. I once took a corner off my viola, which is a very expensive instrument I was borrowing at the time. I wasn't very happy about that. Fortunately, I managed to find the chunk. That was during a recording session. But yeah, there was another time when the first violin's tailpiece, the tail gut broke, and of course that was an enormous snap, and then flop. Things like that have happened. People have kicked their music stands over. People have not been able to work out how their order of pages worked out, because they've had photocopies in the wrong places. Things like that have happened over the years. You name it, we've probably done it at some point.
And how do you manage it when you have those things?
Basically, I think we're all sort of. Well, actually, that's interesting, because I think it's interesting who notices some things and who doesn't notice other things, because often the colleague next to the colleague for whom it's happened, or to whom it's happened, will notice, but across the group it amazes me sometimes what isn't noticed. And certainly what does not get noticed by the audience. It seems like fairly catastrophic on stage, doesn't actually always get picked up by the audience. So, and that's actually another important thing to be aware of, I guess, when you're playing. That actually, of course, we tend to focus on the things that haven't gone as well as we might have hoped, but actually at the expense of all the things that actually went perfectly well.
And what does it feel like when everything's working really, really well on stage with the quartet?
Effortless. And that's a wonderful feeling. I think with any performing, when the idea of the optimum is when we're totally unself-conscious. That's what we all hope for. Certainly, what I hope for. When one's totally in the moment and just sort of swept along by the line, the whole sweep of what we're doing. It's a really exhilarating feeling.
Martin Outram, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you very much.